Okay, welcome to lesson number 1 of Flight Sim School. So today what we're going to do is we're just going to have a quick intro to the game, what you're going to need, and we're going to have a look at our first flight. In terms of hardware and accessories, I won't go into too much detail in this video. I'll probably make another video with more detail. But the basics, what you're going to want is you're going to want some kind of joystick, whether it's a yoke, a joystick with a bunch of buttons on it, a throttle and stick, whatever you want, but you just want something with a few axes that you can control the throttle and the different control surfaces of the plane. The other thing you're going to want is a decent computer to be able to run the game. I'll assume you have one of those and you've got the game installed already. And lastly, you're going to want a decent sized monitor so that you can see what's actually going on. A second monitor can be useful, but it's not really necessary. Alright, so first flights. So when you're first getting the game running, the best thing to do is to just go through and start with the training scenarios that are on the main screen. Just go through all 8 of those. It'll give you a good understanding of how to fly the plane. It'll get you familiar with some of the controls, but not all of them. And you'll probably figure out some things that you might want to tweak with regards to how your buttons are configured on your joystick. So quickly go through those. They'll probably take you about an hour. And once that's done, come back here and we'll go into a little bit more detail and move forward from there. Those intro videos are really good to give you a good understanding of the game and if you're going to actually like the game. But they don't go into much detail as to what you're actually doing and why you're actually doing it. I found that previous flight sim games did a much better job of that. So hopefully I'll try and fill in the gaps there for newcomers to flight sim with this series of videos. So now that you've got those videos under your belt, it's time to look at the basics before we jump into the simulator. So how a plane actually flies. So when air is coming at the plane, basically what happens is the air comes straight at it and it'll hit the wing, it hits the bottom of the wing, and the air hitting the bottom of the wing actually generates lifts and lifts the plane up into the air. There's air that goes above the wing as well, but more air hits the bottom of the wing, which causes the lift to happen and the plane to rise into the air. There's basically 2 ways that you can fly. You can either fly fairly quickly with a low angle of attack, and the angle of attack is basically the angle that the horizon makes with the nose of your plane, as you can see on the little diagram that I've got up there. So if you're flying quickly, you don't have to have a huge angle of attack, and you will be able to keep the airplane at a steady altitude. If you want to fly slower, you can, but to maintain the altitude that you're at, you'll have to have an increased angle of attack. Now, of course, there's a limit to how steep that angle can be before you start running into problems like maintaining altitude and stalling out. So we're going to try and understand those a little bit better once we jump into the simulator. Alright, so the 4 things we're going to be practicing in this first flight is straight and level flight, turns, ascending, and descending. Straight and level is when your wings are straight, you're not going in either direction, and you're not gaining or losing altitude. Turning, as you assume, is you're turning either the plane to the left or to the right, with the wings at an angle to be able to turn the plane. Ascending is when your altitude is increasing, and descending is when your altitude is decreasing. So we're going to practice all 4 of those and a few combinations of them, just to keep it very simple for this first time. Very related to all of these 4 configurations is the attitude of your plane, which, as I was saying before, is the orientation of your nose relative to the horizon. Basically, for example, you can have straight and level flight with a very straight ahead attitude, or you can have straight and level flight with your nose pointing upwards and flying a lot more slowly. So we'll try and experiment with those in the flight coming up right now. Alright, so here we are in the game, and what we're going to do is we're going to set up our first basic flight, and for that we'll just go to the world map. We're going to choose our airplane. In my case, it's already selected. It's the Zealand or Zlin Aviation Cub. Basically, we've chosen this plane because it's a very basic plane. There aren't too many instruments. Keeps it really simple to be able to learn on. You don't have to worry about all the details of all the instruments that you would see either on the Cessna 152 or on the G1000 version of the Cessna 172. All right, with our airplane selected, next thing we are going to choose our airport. So what I recommend, you can basically choose any airport you want, but I like to use the Gold Coast Airport for learning stuff for two reasons. First of all, it's right by the sea, so it's very easy to find and hard to get lost because you can just follow the coast north or south and then just make your way back to it without getting lost. One small thing, just for the purposes of this, we're going to make sure that we start at a ramp. I don't think there are any small ramps here, so we'll just pick any ramp. Really, it doesn't matter so much. Right, and we can see our ramp that we've selected is right there. Right, and then we're going to select our arrival airport. And we'll choose runway 32 for our arrival. Alright, next thing we're going to do is look at the flight conditions. So I recommend turning multiplayer and air traffic off for these first flights, just so you can focus on the flying and don't worry about any of the other environmental stuff that's going on around you. In terms of weather and time, just make sure to choose a preset and choose clear skies, so that basically you have the best conditions to start off with, so you don't have to worry about winds, you don't have to worry about weather. You just want to focus on the flying for now. And then all we have to do is hit fly. Alright, so here we are in the simulator now. We're going to start by doing a quick tour of all the controls of the plane, starting from the outside. So I've got a joystick set up with a throttle. So the joystick part of the controller controls all the basic control surfaces of the plane. So the first one it controls is the elevators. You activate the elevators by pulling backwards or forwards on the joystick, and you can see it's moving the control surface right there. The elevators basically control the up-down motion of the plane, basically sending you higher or lower based on if you're pulling up, you'll go up. If you put down, the plane will pitch down. The ailerons control the bank of the airplane from side to side. Basically what happens is if I turn the joystick left, the plane will start turning left. At which point I can actually recenter the joystick and the plane's going to continue turning left, and we'll see this behavior once we start flying. When you want to cancel out the turn, you actually have to move the joystick slightly to the other side to just cancel out the motion that has the plane going to the left. The rudder at the back here basically controls the yaw of the plane, and that's the axis that goes like this. We'll talk about the rudder more in further videos. For now, just remember that you're using the rudder mostly on the ground, especially if you've got the simulator set to easy or medium, it'll control the rudder for you. So now let's head inside the plane. Inside the plane, we've got the basic view here. The control keys 1 to 9 basically control the different views that you can have within the cockpit. So we'll start with control 2 right here. That's our throttle. So you can see when I move my throttle, you can see it moving back and forwards. And right, if we go to control 2, control 3, here we've got the trim activator. So it's basically a wheel that you turn to control the trim. And the trim basically controls the pitch of your airplane. So let's say you're at a given altitude and you have a given amount of throttle set, you can use the pitch to control if you want the plane to maintain that altitude with that amount of power that you have set, so that you can actually release the pressure on the stick. Otherwise, if you're at, say, 2,000 feet and you've got full power still going, the plane's going to naturally want to rise up higher. The trim will allow you to basically trim out the plane so that you can keep that full power down and maintain your altitude and not gain or lower the altitude. And we'll see that once we hit the simulator as well. All right, on the center console, we've got a bunch of controls. The only ones that really matter for the purposes of this flight are the airspeed indicator here. My airspeed indicator for the Cub is in kilometers an hour. I suspect that's because my computer is set to Canada, which defaults to kilometers. In US, it may be miles per hour. I'm not 100% sure on that. To the left, we have the altimeter, which in my settings isn't set to the correct setting, so I'll just set that right now. Because we're using the default settings and everything's in perfect conditions, the altimeter will just be 29.92. So I'll just set that now so we have the proper altitude, otherwise it'll be confusing when we take off. There we go. And what else we got? So the other important one here is we've got our tachometer. The tachometer is basically exactly like the engine in your car. It's telling you how much power the engine is actually generating. As we'll see when we take off though, unlike your car, the power doesn't actually equate to the speed you're going at. It's the pitch that determines what speed you're actually going at. All right. Other than that, the only other control worth mentioning at this point is probably the compass right here, which tells us our general direction. Luckily, because we're right by the coast, it'll be really easy to orient ourselves. We're going to start by heading out north to our cruise altitude of 2,000 feet. Once we reach there, we'll level off, and we'll turn south and practice a few turns, look at the attitude of the plane in those different turns and different ascents and descents, and then we'll come back towards the airport. All right, with all that done, we're ready to start the engine. And to do that, you could follow through like the entire procedure if you want, but there is a shortcut key to start the plane in Flight Sim, and it's Control E. And it'll just do your startup procedure for you. Here we go. All right, so with that done, we're pretty much ready to taxi to the runway. Because this plane is a tail dragger, what I'm actually going to do is go to the external view. It'll make it a little bit easier to get to the runway. Normally we would ask air traffic control for permission and everything, but because we've basically set everything off, we don't really need to worry about that for this introductory video. We'll learn more about interacting with air traffic control in one of the upcoming videos. Right, so now what I'm going to do is just to get moving, I'm going to apply some power, probably around 2,000 RPM, just to get us moving. Right, there we go, and the plane's now started moving, so I'm going to turn towards the runway and reduce power ever so slightly. Back down to around 1,400 RPM, which will just keep us moving without actually taking up too much speed. So we got some big planes here, so we'll just head out here. Incidentally, if you were flying from inside the cockpit, as you can see, you can sort of see out, but you can't see that great. What a Cub pilot would actually be doing if he was actually in the real plane is he'd actually be doing something called S-turns to be able to see where they're going. So basically what you would end up doing is something like this, where you would turn to the left and turn to the right just to be able to see about where you're going, to make sure you're going straight. But luckily we're in a simulator and we can just simulate it like this. I might skip ahead at this point just to get us more quickly to the runway, and we'll just continue once we're ready for takeoff. Okay, so we're about ready to turn onto the runway. We're just going to quickly go over the instruments that we can see from out here. So on the left you have the airspeed again. This airspeed here is actually in knots rather than kilometers per hour, which is what you see on the inside. We have our engine RPM here, our fuel level, and our angle of attack, which is basically the pitch of the plane. We have our flaps, which we won't need for this flight. More interestingly, we have the trim right here. As I was mentioning, the trim can be used basically so that you can reduce pressure on the stick, either forward or backwards, and basically hold whatever attitude you want the plane to stay in. We'll see that and we'll play with it as we level off later on. We have the vertical speed here, which basically tells you how quickly or slowly your airplane is gaining altitude up or down. We won't really need it for this flight either. We'll really be able to rely almost entirely on the altimeter right here. So with that said, I'm going to taxi onto the runway. Now the tail is going to come up fairly quickly on the Cub. And what we want to do is when the power comes up to around 40 or so knots, what we want to do is actually pull the tail up. So you'd push slightly forward on the joystick to bring it up. And then at around 60, you're going to rotate the plane, which is basically just pulling back on the joystick to take off. I'm actually going to do first part of the takeoff from the external view just because it's a little bit easier to control, because as you see, as we're going to apply full throttle, the plane's going to want to pull to the left, and that's because of the gyroscopic motion of the propeller. So it's just a little bit easier to control again from the outside because you're able to see where you're going, whereas you can't as easily see from inside the cockpit. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to apply full power. Wait for the airspeed to come alive. There we go. And at 60 knots, I'm just going to pull up. And there we go. We're airborne. Alrighty. So now that we've got some altitude and everything seems alright, I'm just going to bring the power back ever so slightly to around 4,500 RPM. And what we're going to do is we're going to continue our slow climb out to 2,000 feet on the current heading that we're on. So you don't have to worry about setting the trim or anything. You just let the plane accelerate and hold the acceleration it wants to do. So if we have a look from the outside now, if we look at the side view of the plane, you can actually see here that we've got a fairly nose-up attitude. The wind, like we discussed in the theory section, is coming at the airplane, and it's causing the airplane to go up. So more air is hitting the bottom of the wing, which is generating lift, which is bringing the plane further up. And you can see we're pretty much maintaining our airspeed, and I'm not putting any pressure at all on the joystick. I'm just letting the plane increase its altitude as it wants. So we're going to be coming up very quickly on our cruise altitude of 2,000 feet, at which point what we're going to do is we're going to reduce power to around 3,500 RPM, which should give us our cruise altitude. Alright, so it's coming up now, so I'll just reduce power. And as you can see, the nose of the engine drops down as we reduce power. And that makes sense because as we're reducing power, less air is hitting the bottom of the wing and therefore generating less lift. Alright, and there we go. We're pretty much level, a little below 2,000 feet, but about where we want to be. So what we're going to do first is we're actually going to turn south. We'll turn south just because it'll make it a little bit easier to get back to the airport once we're done. So to do that, like we were saying when we were on the ground, all you do is you apply some right side pressure on the joystick and you can see the plane just starts turning. We've got a very light turn right now. If we wanted to increase, you just push a little bit more and then recenter the joystick again. And you'll notice in a turn the plane has a tendency to drop. That's because the lift that's being generated on the bottom side of the wing is actually less than the other side of the wing, so the nose actually wants to drop a little. So you have to apply just the slightest amount of back pressure to the joystick to keep yourself level at your altitude. Okay, so now that we're heading south, what we're going to do is we're going to do a few practices to just understand better the relationship that we were talking about between airspeed, power, and altitude. So right now, as you can see, we're pretty much leveled out. Our trim, we haven't touched it at all. We haven't had to touch it at all. The first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to add more power and see what happens. So I'll just increase power to around, let's say about 4,000 RPM. And what happens? Does the plane accelerate? No, the plane actually starts going up. And that's because, like we've been saying, more air is hitting the bottom of the wing, which is generating lift, which is bringing the airplane higher. All right. Now, as you can see, we've reached the exact altitude that we want, 2,000 feet, but the plane's still increasing its altitude. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to use the trim to hold 2,000 feet. So I will cancel out the increase in altitude, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit the trim down button, which on my joystick I've basically set it to one of the buttons on the throttle. And I'm just going to touch it ever so slightly, and you can see it's just slightly moving down there. If you have a look at the trim indicator right here, you can see it just barely edging towards the downside. You really don't need huge changes in trim for very small changes like this. You really want to make very small adjustments and go from there. So you see now I think I may have done just a little too much trim down, so I'll just add a bit of trim up. And then there we go. We're nice and canceled out, and we're in our straight and level flight at 2,000 feet. All right, let's just have a quick look where the airport is. All right, we're basically beamed the runway right now, so we'll just keep going a little bit further. And we're going to practice a few more turns, a few more ascents and descents. And you can continue to experiment with this as much as you want. Just remember to whatever changes you're making to the plane, it's always a balance. You're trading some kind of energy for some kind of other energy. So if I want to increase altitude, I'm trading gasoline energy to generate more lift to go higher. Yep. And just to be safe, let's give ourselves just a little bit more altitude to play with our turns. So I'm going to increase power again. I'll put it to around 4,500 RPM, and plane will just start lifting again. And again, I could be on the inside here if I really want. I'm mostly using the external view here, basically just to give you a better idea of what I'm doing. So we'll climb up to around 2,500 feet, and then we'll do a few turns and head back to the runway for our landing. Alright, coming up on 2,500 feet. I'll reduce power slightly because I expect around 4,000 RPM is what I'll need to hold 2,500. Seems about right. Okay, so we're at 2,500 feet. We have 4,000 RPM on the tack, and our altitude's basically level. All right, so the next thing I want you to practice is a lot more turns. I want you to practice turning left, practice turning right. You can also practice an ascending turn, a descending turn. And when you're doing all of those, try and do it from the external view. Because it's your first flights, I really want you to understand better how the controls are actually moving the plane around. So for example, if I were to turn left, you can see just barely the ailerons turning the plane left. It's a little hard to see how much of a bank angle you have from the external view, at least I find, so you might actually be better doing that from the inside. And you can practice turning sharper if you want, and practice maintaining the altitude while you're doing that. So you can see as I'm getting into a sharper and sharper turn, the nose wants to pitch down, so I'm just putting that slightest little bit of upward pressure on the stick to keep us at that 2,500 feet. And you can practice that as much as you want, just so you get comfortable with those controls as much as possible. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually head back to the airport for our first landing. So what we'll do to get us started is we'll just have a look where the airport is. So there is a neat button in Flight Simulator 2020 that will actually look at the closest point of interest, which in this case is an airport, and we can see it right there in the distance. So we've got a fair distance there, and we're at 2,500 feet, and the airport is at basically sea level, which, as we mentioned in the theory section, is why I use this airport, because it makes it nice and easy to practice at. So I'm actually going to reduce power to around, we'll say 3,500 RPM to start, to slowly start our descent down. And conveniently, we're almost perfectly lined up with the runway. I just lowered power just a little bit more because we're coming in a little fast right now. We are going to have to level off soon, but I don't want to have too much airspeed going in. Here's where you might want to consider adding a bit of trim up, basically to hold the airplane in a slower descent. You'll want to keep an eye on your airspeed, of course. If your airspeed goes too low, you risk stalling, and a stall in a plane is different from a car. The engine doesn't stop, but the plane will very quickly lose altitude. We'll look at stalls in probably the next video. So now we're at around 3,000 feet. Sorry, we're at around 1,500 feet with around 3,000 RPM. And we have a nice stable descent of around 500 feet per minute. Luckily, we're already lined up with the runway. So what I like to do when landing is I actually like to press up to have a better view of the runway. But if you prefer to be from here, you can as well. It really just depends what you prefer. But the goal when you're landing is to basically choose a point at the end of the runway, so right around here, and you want to keep it at the same spot in your view screen. So basically you've pointed the nose at it and you want to keep it in, basically pointing at that point on the runway. Once you get close to the bottom of the runway, we're actually going to look towards the end of the runway, the other end of the runway. But until then, you basically want to aim for that spot and just keep going for it. And again, keep an eye on your airspeed, keep an eye on how quickly you're losing altitude. So right now we're a little fast still, so I'm going to reduce power to around 2,500 RPM. So we lose some airspeed. And again, I'm just keeping the runway at the same spot in my view screen here. And I'm not perfectly lined up, so I'll just turn a little that way to bring the runway back to center. There we go. And I still keep the same spot in the runway, and the same spot in my view screen. My airspeed's a little fast still, so we'll start lowering the power a little bit more, around 2,000 RPM or so, 2,200. For final approach, line up again. Right, and now we're getting close. We're going to look more towards the end of the runway. A little too much power. Basically what we're doing here is we're holding the plane fairly straight to lose altitude, make sure we're going to land perfectly. We're losing some speed. We've crossed the threshold, and I'm just going to reduce power even more. And there we go. We're on the ground. At this point, you can hit the brakes, which I've once again mapped to a button on my throttle. And hold the rudder down, and once the nose falls backwards, that's probably about the right time to switch to the external view so you can see what you're doing. And I'll just come to a full stop on the runway because, well, there's no other traffic right now and it doesn't really matter for this first flight. And there we go. Oops, that was a little too hard. Alright, so that's it. I hope you learned something useful in this first flight. Everything about straight and level flight, ascending flight, descending flight, and your first landing. If you have any questions, you can make sure to put them in the comments below, and thank you for watching.